Brooke doesn't talk. We know she can say words because over the last 20 years, Brooke has said words here or there. Sometimes they were swear words, sometimes they were, she had a few favorites. But and I know it's from me driving in the car where she picked up some of those. But Brooke, for some reason, we don't know if it's the seizure activity that's always kind of going on constantly in her head, but she tends to forget or just stop saying words. And so we may not hear words for 5 or 6 years. We may suddenly hear a few words, and then there'll be a period of silence for maybe another 3 or 4 years. And this is one of those times right now when Brooke just isn't really saying any words. And so we've preloaded some of the things. So if you guys have questions for Brooke, she certainly wants you to ask them. Just know that I may answer them on her behalf because it would take us an incredibly long time to figure out how to get them. It took me a long time to figure out how to get this Proloquo app figured out and programmed. And so you would be here an hour while we tried to answer that. So just bear with us. So again, there's a couple different PowerPoints. There's copies if you want them on the back. And so we wanted just to start with kind of defining what a typical life is. And that's going to be different for each one of us and each one of you, what that is. It's going to be defined by your experiences. So if you grew up around people with disabilities, if you had a family member with a disability, that may have been a very typical life for you. It may not have been, and having a child with a disability and suddenly getting some diagnosis may be all new to you. And so you've had to kind of think, what does typical mean to us? Notice we don't use the word normal because I don't know that any of us are normal. We're all, every single one of us has probably got a little bit of abnormal something with us. But also it's defined by your cultural beliefs. So it could be that English is not your first language, and so you may have some cultural beliefs from the country that you grew up in, and so that may define kind of how you view a typical life and how you view disabilities. We know it's also influenced by every professional and every parent that we come into contact with. Some of what Brooke's typical life looks like today was certainly influenced by some of her teachers and some of her therapists and doctors over the years, but really more importantly, it was influenced by other parents. I got to meet parents whose kids were older than Brooke. They may not have had the same disabilities that Brooke did, but watching them and what they learned through the journey really helped inform me and may have changed the trajectory of Brooke's life because we decided to go down a different path than we had maybe originally thought because another parent shared something that we just hadn't thought of and allowed us to kind of go out of the box. And unfortunately, we know a typical life can be reflected by what happens when they leave high school. And so I just briefly want to share with you just a couple outcomes of what life is like after high school. And some of you may be living that if you're here as an adult with a disability or getting ready to graduate, so you may already feel this every day. And some of you as parents whose kids are younger, this unfortunately may put you in a really depressed mood for a few minutes, but we'll get you pumped back up because the outcomes for kids with disabilities leaving high school are not great. So this first one talks about employment. And so this was from the Department of Labor at the federal level. They have an office on disability employment policy. And when you go to their website, you can look to see what the employment rates are for youth with and without disabilities. So last month, the month of June, 31% of kids that were aged 20 to 24 with disabilities had a job. They were employed. So that was 31%. When you look at their peers who are 20 to 24-year-olds who don't have a disability, almost 68% of them were employed. And so you could see it's typically usually half of the employment rate. So already our kids that are leaving school are already underemployed as compared to their peers who don't have a disability. We know that, here's some other statistics that were done from the National Longitudinal Transition Study. So there's been this thing for over 12 years. They've been collecting data on some of the same kids that left school 12 years ago. They've been following them. So every few years, they do a new round of data collection as these kids get older and older. So they started when they were in high school, and now many of them are approaching 30 years old. And they've wanted to see what happened to them when they were in school and what happened when they left. And so this was a round that they did several years ago when they went back and talked to these kids about 8 years out of high school. So 39% of youth that had intellectual disabilities were employed, working an average of 28 hours a week. So that's somewhat similar to what we just saw in June, that about 31% of kids with disabilities overall were employed. We know those who have some type of college experience, some type of post-secondary education, were more likely to be employed out of high school, 83% of them. So if we could get them into some type of adult education or post-secondary education experience, they ended up having a better rate of getting employed and having even more pay. So if those who just had a high school diploma, who just left right from high school, did not get any kind of certificate or college degree that had disability, it was 38 to 58%, depending on what that disability was. So again, certainly there's a high need for us to get kids into some type of adult education and continue learning when they leave school. 25,000 or less has been kind of the typical income. We know that's basically poverty, because you're looking at people barely making enough to pay their rent and have food and have a, pay for transportation or anything else. So we know, again, some of these statistics, we're keeping people in poverty, and we want to get that. We want to get people out of poverty. Here's just a little bit more data that talks about college. What's interesting about this slide is it talks about the number of people with disabilities who went on to college, who went on to four-year college, who went on to a two-year college, went on to a trade or business school with a variety of different disabilities. Sometimes they were degree seeking, so they were getting an associate's degree, so they may have had physical or sensory disabilities. It may have been kids who had an intellectual disability and were going to some type of certificate program on a campus. But of those kids, as you can see, there was 44% went to a two-year college, 32% went to some type of business or vocational school. 19%, that's really low, went to a four-year college. What's really startling, though, is how many drop out. So the majority of them, at least half or higher, never finished. So we have a problem retaining kids. So once they get in there, the supports are falling apart, and we're not able to keep kids in that school program. And so we have a big issue of how we can not only get them access so they get to those programs, because clearly not enough are even getting access, but then when they're there, they're not able to complete the program. This is just a little bit from what happens in the community. So those who have relationships with people in the community, that's really important. They have, many of them have see their friends weekly. Now, when we're looking at kids with multiple or intellectual disabilities, about half. So if you're someone with a little bit more significant disabilities or intellectual disabilities, about half say that they actually have connections and friends in the community. It's higher for other disabilities. It's closer to 75 to 80%. And so people are getting there. There's this group of young kids who they've been following for 10 or 12 years. They're getting there. They're making friends. They're meeting people because they've had some opportunities to go to college or because they've been working. So they've been building up their network of friends. But we know you saw how many were going, so it's not that many. So we know that there's a lot of people out there who are disengaged, completely not connected with their community. And the other one is that people just don't have bank accounts. We have got to start bank accounts for people with disabilities when they're young. Brooks, unfortunately, we didn't even think about starting a bank account probably till Brooke was 17 or 18 years old. And so we ourselves just never thought about how important it was for Brooke to have her own bank account. It's important for all of us. When I was a kid, I had a savings account, and I loved going and even putting $2 in my savings account at the bank. And that experience is important for people with disabilities as well. And so we see very few had any type of credit cards, bank accounts, anything. And so we need to, as opposed to their peers who don't have disabilities, where most of them do, the majority have access to those. So what Brooke and I want to talk about is how we get kind of from here, where she was when she was born, to where she is now today. Okay, you ready?
I am Brooke Yarbrough. I am 20. I am Griggs, girl raised in the South. Of the two of us, my mama is the more conservative one.
Okay, you ready?
That's me. I was born 13 weeks early and had massive bleeding in the brain that caused me to have cerebral palsy, epilepsy, cortical visual impairments, and intellectual disabilities. Woohoo! I am a high school graduate. It is important to know that I live outside the services system. I live a life of my choosing, not one dictated by the service system. I do receive special education supports. I am a post-grad. I still go to school to work on communication and job IEP goals. I just started getting supplemental security income. I think that it will keep me poor, so I hope my dog business booms in 2014 and 2015 so I can stop getting it. I don't want my earning potential limited by SSA.
So getting from where Brooke was, what she just talked about, where she was born, Brooke was born at 26 weeks. She had 28 weeks. There were lots of complications with the birthing process. Brooke lived in the hospital much of the first year of life. She was diagnosed at about 18 months old with a variety of disability labels. So getting from her, from that little 2-pound baby up to an 80-pound 20-year-old, this is what it really took. It took that her family had a vision for the future, and so that we were able to dream. And that was something that we didn't even give ourselves permission to for a long time. We were, to be honest, we're dealing with the day-to-days of all of the therapy appointments, getting her to lots of, she was still in and out of the hospital quite a bit. We didn't know if she was going to survive. We were worried about the next day. We were worried about the 14 pills at the time she was taking for her seizures. We were worried about how to pay the bills because we had these huge, humongous hospital bills as well as all of the therapy bills. At the time, early intervention there was no insurance mandate, so we had to pay for early intervention services because our insurance didn't cover it. And so we were really worried about some of that. And so it wasn't until the doctor talked to us about having this vision for the future that we, and what were our dreams, that we really took the time to think about that. And Brooke will share a slide in a moment about that. We had to have expectations, and I cannot stress enough, we've got to have high expectations. The things about kids going to college, when Brooke was born, that wasn't happening. There were very few programs around the United States for people with disabilities, intellectual disabilities, and autism to be able to go to college if they didn't have a regular diploma. And even if they did have a regular diploma, they still were struggling to get into college. Who would have thought in 2008 that our Congress, who can't get a lot done, actually passed a bill to say they're going to start programs and they're going to help colleges in our country have college programs for students just for intellectual disabilities. And so we wouldn't have thought that. So you've always got to have high expectations and be reaching for the stars. We also, I think it takes a life that's balanced with formal and informal and paid and unpaid supports. As Brooke mentioned, doesn't receive, she just recently in the last year went on to the ID waiver waiting list. It was something we were not interested in. We knew there was waiting lists. We weren't really interested in the services that Virginia offered on their waivers. And so Brooke was not connected to the Community Service Board. They knew of her because she went through early intervention services, but then she transitioned over to the school, and that's really where the supports Brooke were getting. Everything else was provided by her father and I, or friends or relatives. We used people that we knew in the community, grandparents, to provide those supports for Brooke. And that's what we wanted. We wanted her to be part of that community. And to be honest, I didn't want to have a life that was just paid by Medicaid, because there was always a risk that will go away. And we wanted to build a life that was built on the way we wanted it for our family and for Brooke. And then we'd figure out how to pay for it, whether that was through private insurance, public money, whether we begged, borrowed, and stealed from friends and neighbors to make some of it happen. We didn't steal from anyone, just to clarify. It also took, as Brooke got older, really believing in self-determination and really believing that Brooke could be the captain of her own ship. People look at Brooke and think, particularly some of her peers in school, and really see her as having very significant disabilities and may not even think of her as having a lot of worth. She certainly doesn't have any friendships. The people that she knew in school and elementary, by the time they got to middle, it wasn't cool to hang out with the kids who were kind of near the back of the school building, who had to work in the cafeteria at lunch while their peers without disabilities got to eat lunch. And some of her classmates were actually working and handing out silverware. So they didn't really have a good view of who Brooke was as she got older. And so it was important for us to make sure that we learned how to take a step to the side. We never took a step away from Brooke, and we never will, because even my father, who's in his 80s, has never stopped advocating with and for me. I still call him for help with decision making, and we support Brooke in her decision making. But it's important for us to have the respect to say that Brooke can make some decisions. We don't know if there could be complicated decisions or not, but we know that she has the right to choose what she wants to eat, what she wants to wear. All of us have that right. right. And as we move up in complexity of the decisions, Brooke may need more support. And it may come from her father and I, or it may come from other people that we know that are part of Brooke's support, a circle of support and network in the community. We may step to the side and they may decide to help Brooke with some decisions. And it takes all of us working together. This is really that family vision statement. So it's hard to read on there and it's hard to read here, but one of Brooke's doctors, when she was, I don't know, maybe 2.5, asked us about our dreams. And it really was the first time. And they said to us, the doctor said, she said, you know what, Brooke looks great, she's cute. I'm just going to leave her over here in her little, whatever we were carrying around at the time, she was teeny and little. And she said, I want to talk to you and your husband. I want to talk to you all about how things are going with you. What supports do you need as her parents? And what is your dream? And we really didn't know. So she really suggested that we think about that and come up with what is our vision for Brooke. And so we developed a vision statement that we've had now for a long time for Brooke. And we change it every so often. The people at school have it. It's at her doctor's office. We certainly have it at home. But it was important for us to be able to say to other people in Brooke's life, this is what's important to her family. And it really does talk about that she has a life of her choosing, not one that's dictated by the system. Talks that Brooke is more than just having disabilities. That Brooke has a lot of other interest areas. In this particular version, it talks about Brooke's things like she loves chicken. That's one of her favorite foods. She has to have sweet iced tea at every meal. She's definitely a Southern girl. She loves dancing, playing with a computer. She loves the dogs and her dog boarding business. And it's also that Brooke's doesn't need to be fixed. One of my biggest gripes when she was going through the school system were the instructional assistants wore nursing outfits. And it drove me crazy that it appeared that they were nurses working in a school system in those classrooms where Brooke was in and out of regular education classrooms and she was in and out of self-contained special education only classes. And so as she moved in and out of those throughout her day, it drove me crazy when people came up and had nurse scrubs on, because that perpetuates this stereotype that people with disabilities they have to be cured, they have to be fixed, that there's something wrong with them. And so that was something that I was not happy about. And so we spent more and more time advocating for Brooke to be in regular education classrooms because I wanted her peers to see her differently. And when she was in high school, she's clearly bored with the story. We had the opportunity to we just, for whatever reason, things really clicked in high school. Not so much in middle school, but in high school, we had some people who were willing to really just open up their classrooms. They claimed they had never had a child with disabilities like Brooke be in regular education classrooms in that high school. And I believe it, because it's a smaller high school. It's where my husband and his family went. They didn't see a lot of kids with disabilities when they went to school. It's because they were running a sheltered workshop in that school building up until the year before Brooke got there. And so that's where they put most of the kids who had more significant disabilities went into that one classroom, and they had jobs that they would get, and they stuffed envelopes or things all day long. And so that was not going to happen for Brooke. And so we were really lucky that we got a new teacher that came in that year. They disbanded that sheltered workshop. We said we want Brooke to be in regular classes. She's going to own her own business. The business department was waffling, and they finally said, let's try it. So they took her under their wing, and they outlined some classes that Brooke could go to. And we began to do all of her homework. We did them in PowerPoint. So whenever she had a homework assignment, we would help Brooke develop a PowerPoint in response, and we would help script what the words were, and then we'd send it to the school. The teacher would print it off, and then one of Brooke's classmates had to get up and present Brooke's homework with her. And so they would read the script. And at the end of each year, or end of each semester, the students would write something back about what it was like to have Brooke in their classroom. And so many of them, we kept all of those, and we used to have them as part of her IEP meeting because it was so powerful to hear the impact that she had on these 16, 17-year-olds. They had no idea she actually owns a house, and she'll talk about her house, that they didn't realize that she wanted maybe to get married. They just never even thought of that because, again, they didn't see Brooke in the same way because they never got to see her because in many years she was just hidden in the building. The other one I'll just mention before Brooke talks about decision making is just the expectations. I've already talked about how important it is to have expectations, but the research also shows it. The research shows that if parents have high expectations, they're engaged in their child's life, they're going to do better educationally, they're going to have more success in the community and in their life because someone believes in them. And so we can't stress enough the power of expectations. And then these are people in mine and Brooke's life. So when Brooke was born and I began to kind of think about and have those dreams, by the time she got to elementary school, I grew up with my grandmother's in the top corner, Brooke's great-grandmother, and she was a woman who worked during the war building airplanes while the men were over fighting. And so she was working in the factories building airplanes. She was the first woman that was elected to the Board of Supervisors in the town in Maine. They had never had a woman ever, and they didn't want a woman. And my grandmother busted through that door. And she also owned her own antique business. And so my grandmother was a very strong influence on my mother. My mother is down in the bottom corner, Brooke's grandmother, and she owned a business from in the 70s when we lived outside of Boston. She was the first woman that was elected to head up the Chamber of Commerce in that town. She got to do a lot of other things in the town to, again, break those stereotypes that women could be strong leaders in the community. My sister's not on here, but my sister owned her own businesses. She has owned jewelry businesses and tattoo businesses. Surprisingly, around the country. And so my sister was also raised in this family where we were all expected that women should be leaders in the community. So there was no reason why we couldn't be married, have children, but also have when I went to high school, I had to take shorthand because the expectation was we would all be secretaries when we left school. And my mother said, you could take shorthand all you want, but you're going to own your own business. And so the parent-to-parent is something that I've been a business owner of since 2000. And so we were just each generation, so there was no different for Brooke. When I got over that initial shock of having a child with all these disabilities, no book came home from the hospital with Brooke about how to do anything, raise her, how to attend to some of these things. My husband and I didn't have any other children. We were both about 30. He's a little bit younger than me. About 30 when Brooke was born. So now you know how old I am. And she, we didn't know how to deal with it. First of all, we have a kid, and second of all, she was 2 pounds, and so. It was important as Brooke got into school, and particularly a little bit more into elementary towards 5th grade, that I said she's going to own her own business. And so there was certainly not a lot of agreement at the IEP table about that when they saw Brooke and what they thought their expectations of Brooke were much lower. So it was, the expectation was she's going to own a business just like any one of us. And all of my family was behind that. Every single one of them was in agreement.
This is a power of attorney. Right now, my parents can help me make financial, educational, and legal decisions, but I could change that to someone else if I want. My mom is also a dual signature on my bank account. I don't want a guardian. If I had one, I would lose my rights. I love voting in the presidential election. That is my right as a citizen that I could lose with a guardian. Fortunately, my mom does training on this topic and knew about alternatives to guardianship. Respect my right to make my own decisions with support. I need a lot of help, but I am not incompetent.
That should be incompetent, but.
Just because I don't talk doesn't mean that I don't know what is going on. In fact, if you got to hang with me for a while, you would see that I am very inquisitive, or nosy as my mom sometimes said. This is my one-pager. This tells people who don't know me a little bit about who I am and how to support me. My doctor, school, and family members have a copy. In elementary school, my mama told my IEP team that I would own my own business. They told her she was in denial. After that, every IEP after that had a goal towards self-employment. During high school, I had a great transition specialist. He never worked with anyone like me who doesn't talk. But he'll listen to me through my behavior. He knew I was interested in dogs, water, and music. These are some places I went to visit or where I volunteered, like a choir, a DJ company, and a dog rescue. The dog rescue is my favorite. That is how we decided that the dog boarding business would be the right self-employment for me. Here's my typical life. That's my house. My daddy's aunt left me the house when I was 8. Aunt Evelyn had polio as a child and had difficulty walking. She wanted to give me something to make my life easier. That is my business, Brooks Happy Tales Dog Boarding and Pet Sitting. I opened it 1 month after graduating high school. Along my journey to self-employment, these are things that worked or that got in the way for my mama and me. My mama and I didn't like when people said no. We liked when they said, how can we make it happen?